They told us about invention, but they forgot Lewis Latimer. They told us about literature, but they forgot Phyllis Wheatley. They told us about revolution, but they forgot Toussaint Louverture. They told us about medicine, but left out Dr. Daniel Hale Williams and Nurse Mary Seacole. For centuries, the story has been told, but it has not always been told whole. Names were celebrated, contributions were amplified, achievements were engraved, and others were footnotes or silence. History is not only what happened, it is what is remembered, and what is remembered shapes what a generation believes about itself. This is not a story of anger, it is a story of restoration, because in the face of erasure, we rose and we are still rising. There was a time in this country, in every country, when Black voices were silenced, when contributions were overlooked, when brilliance existed but recognition did not. There were doors that would not open, seats that could not be taken, opportunities that were denied, not because of ability, but because of identity. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine having a gift, a brilliant mind, a creative spirit, an extraordinary talent, and being told, not with words, but with locked doors and turned backs, that your gift doesn't count, that your voice doesn't matter, that you don't belong. That was the reality for generations of Black people across this world, not in the distant ancient past, not in some far off history book. Here, in our cities, in our towns, in our schools, in our courts, in our churches, on our streets, in our own neighborhoods. And yet we endured, we built, we led, we created, we rose, not because the world made it easy, but because we refused to let the world make it impossible. Before we celebrate, and we will celebrate, we must first acknowledge the weight of what was carried. Slavery wasn't just an economic system, it was a deliberate, systematic destruction of identity. It stripped people of their names, their languages, their families, their histories, and their humanity. It told an entire people through law, through violence, through generations of oppression, that they were less than human. And when slavery ended, the silence didn't. Segregation took its place. Jim Crow laws in the United States, the color bar in South Africa, colonial oppression across the African continent, racial exclusion in Canada, the Caribbean, the United Kingdom. Everywhere Black people dared to exist, systems were built to keep them beneath. The message was always the same. Your story doesn't matter. Your history doesn't count. Your contributions aren't worth remembering. But here is what those systems could never account for. You cannot silence brilliance forever. Black History Month exists because for too long the history books told an incomplete story. They told us about inventors, but left out Lewis Howard Latimer, the Black engineer whose improvements made the light bulb practical, who worked alongside both Edison and Bell, and whose name most people have never heard. They told us about medicine, but left out Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who performed the world's first successful open heart surgery in 1893. A Black man who literally held a human heart in his hands and brought it back to life, decades before the world thought such a thing was possible. They told us about space, but left out Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, the Black women mathematicians whose calculations made NASA's space missions possible. When John Glenn refused to launch until Katherine Johnson personally verified the numbers, that was the moment the world quietly admitted what it would take decades to publicly acknowledge, that Black brilliance was not just present, it was essential. They told us about literature, but left out Phyllis Wheatley, who became the first African American and one of the first American women to publish a book of poetry in 1773. A woman who had been enslaved, who taught herself to read against every obstacle, and who wrote with a power that left the world speechless. They told us about music, but never fully acknowledged that jazz, blues, rock and roll, soul, funk, hip hop, the musical languages that shaped the entire modern world, when were born from Black creativity, Black pain, Black joy, and Black genius. They told us about freedom movements, but minimized the thousands of unnamed, unrecorded, uncelebrated people who marched, organized, prayed, fought, and died so that future generations could breathe free. Black History Month is the correction of that incomplete story. It is the restoration of names that were erased, the recognition of contributions that were stolen, the honoring of a legacy that was never given its proper place in the human story. Black history is not just American history, it is world history. It is the story of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history, which produced the world's first Black republic in 1804 and sent shockwaves of fear through every slave-owning nation on earth. It is the story of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison rather than surrender his dignity, and who walked out of those prison gates not with bitterness, but with a vision for a nation that could heal itself. It is the story of Wangari Maathai of Kenya, who planted trees and planted hope, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and who showed the world that environmental justice and human dignity are inseparable. It is the story of Marcus Garvey, is born in Jamaica, who traveled the world igniting a fire of Black pride, Black power, and Black self-determination that influenced civil rights movements on every continent. It is the story of Mary Seacole, the Jamaican British nurse who traveled to the Crimean War at her own expense and saved countless lives while the world ignored her, only to be rediscovered generations later as one of history's great unsung heroes. It is the story of mathematicians and scientists, poets and philosophers, warriors and peacemakers, builders and dreamers, from ancient Africa to the modern world, whose contributions form the foundation of human civilization itself. Black history does not begin with slavery. It does not begin with oppression. It begins with the cradle of civilization, with the ancient kingdoms of Kush, Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe, with scholars at the University of Timbuktu when Europe was still in the Dark Ages, with Egyptian pharaohs who built monuments so extraordinary that people still can't agree on how they were constructed. Black history is the oldest human history on earth, and Black History Month is simply our annual reminder to honor it. What Black History Month is and isn't. Let's be honest about something. Black History Month is sometimes reduced to a checklist, a few social media posts, a classroom lesson about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., a corporate email about diversity. That is not enough. Black History Month is not a performance. It is not a checkbox. It is not a consolation prize for centuries of exclusion. It is an invitation to every person of every background to engage honestly with a history that has shaped everything about the world we live in. It is an invitation to ask uncomfortable questions. Why didn't I learn this in school? Whose version of history have I been taught? What stories have been left out? And why? What does it mean that we need a designated month to remember contributions that should never have been forgotten? These are not questions designed to make anyone feel guilty. They are questions designed to make everyone more honest. Because here is the truth. An incomplete history produces an incomplete understanding of the present. When we don't know that Black scientists helped build the modern world, we make assumptions about Black intellectual capacity. When we don't know that Black communities have been systematically undermined for generations, we misunderstand the inequalities we see today. When we don't know the full stories, the whole complex, painful, magnificent story, we cannot build the kind of future that honors it. Black History Month is not about guilt, it is about truth. And truth, as difficult as it sometimes is always the beginning of something better. If you study Black history long enough, you begin to notice something, a thread that runs through every story, every struggle, every triumph. It is the thread of faith. Harriet Tubman didn't navigate the Underground Railroad alone. She said, "I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." But she also said she relied on God for every step of the journey. Her faith was not a supplement to her courage. It was the source of it. Nelson Mandela, in his darkest years on Robben Island, held onto a belief that justice would prevail, that the arc of history, however long, bends toward freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't lead a movement fueled by anger alone. He led it fueled by an unshakable conviction that every human being is created in the image of God, and that any system which denies that truth is not just unjust, but spiritually wrong. The spirituals sung by enslaved people weren't just music. They were coded messages. They were prayers. They were declarations of a dignity that no human institution could take away. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Black history is at its core a spiritual story. It is the story of people who held on to their humanity when the world tried to strip it away, who held on to hope when circumstances gave them every reason to abandon it, who held on to faith when faith seemed like the only thing left. And that faith, that unshakable, unreasonable, revolutionary faith, produced miracles. It produced freedom movements. It produced great literature and great music. It produced scientists and scholars and leaders and prophets. It produced communities that rebuilt themselves from nothing again and again and again. The world tried to break Black people, and instead the world was changed by them. How far we have come. Let us take a moment to acknowledge the distance traveled. There was a time when Black people could not vote. Now, Black men and women hold the highest offices in nations across the world. President Obama held the highest office with First Lady Michelle Obama. There was a time when Black children were barred from schools. Now, Black scholars lead universities, publish groundbreaking research, and sit on the most prestigious academic boards in the world. There was a time when Black artists were told their creativity wasn't valid, their music wasn't worthy, their stories weren't worth telling. Now, Black art, music, literature, and culture shape global consciousness. There was a time when Black entrepreneurs couldn't get loans, couldn't open bank accounts, couldn't own property in certain neighborhoods. Now, Black business owners, CEOs, and entrepreneurs are building empires across every industry. There was a time when Black athletes were barred from competing alongside white athletes. Now, Black men and women dominate global sports, not because they were given opportunities, but because when the doors finally cracked open, they walked through them and never looked back. We have come far. Not far enough, though. The journey is not over. The work is not finished. The inequalities are real, and the systems that produce them are still standing. But the distance traveled deserves to be acknowledged because it was traveled on the backs of people who endured the unendurable, who built without permission, who led without recognition, who created without credit, who rose again and again and again. No matter how many times the world tried to push them down, and that deserves more than a month. It deserves a lifetime of remembering. Progress is real, but so is the work that remains. Across the world, Black communities still face disproportionate poverty, not because of lack of effort, but because of systems designed over centuries to limit accumulation of wealth, unequal access to education. Despite generations of Black scholars educators and leaders who proved that the playing field was never level over representation in prison systems, not because of inherent criminality, but because of policing practices and justice systems built on racial bias, underrepresentation in positions of power, in boardrooms, in government, in media, in medicine, in law. The gap between talent and opportunity remains real. The psychological weight of racism, the daily experience of being judged by the color of your skin, of having to prove your humanity, of carrying a history of trauma that the world rarely acknowledges. Black History Month is not the solution to these problems, but it is part of the foundation on which solutions are built. Because when people know their history, their full history, their true history, they find the strength to keep building. When you know that your ancestors survived the Middle Passage, you know you can survive the obstacles you face today. When you know that your grandmothers and grandfathers built communities from nothing, you know you have that same capacity in you. When you know that the people who came before you faced worse and still rose, you know that rising is in your DNA. History is not just the past, it is the fuel for the future. If you are Black, you come from greatness, not from suffering alone, though your ancestors suffered, not from endurance alone, though your ancestors endured. You come from builders, from dreamers, from creators, from warriors, from scholars, from prophets, from kings and queens. The same blood that ran through Harriet Tubman's veins runs through yours. The same spirit that carried Nelson Mandela through 27 years of imprisonment lives in you. The same creativity that produced jazz and blues and hip hop and Afro beats and every musical revolution of the modern era, that creativity belongs to you. Do not let anyone tell you that your story is small. Do not let anyone reduce your history to slavery and suffering. Do not let anyone make you feel like you are a footnote in someone else's story. You are the headline. You are the story. You are the legacy. And the best chapters, they haven't been written yet. Write them. If you are not Black, this history belongs to you too, not to claim, not to appropriate, but to understand, because the world you live in, the music you love, the food you eat, the democracy you benefit from, the medical advances that have saved your life, the literature that has moved you, the movements that have expanded freedom for everyone, all of it has been shaped by Black people. Black history is not a separate category from world history. It is world history. And the more honestly we all engage with it, the more we acknowledge what was stolen, what was erased, what was denied, the more clearly we can see what we owe each other going forward. Not guilt, not pity, not charity. Acknowledgement, respect, justice, partnership. That is what Black History Month asks of all of us. There was a time when Black voices were silenced. That time is not completely over, but it is ending with every story told, with every name remembered, with every young Black child who learns that people who look like them change the world. The silence shrinks with every teacher who expands their curriculum beyond the comfortable stories, with every institution that honestly examines its history, with every person who chooses truth over comfortable mythology, and the silence shrinks and the rising continues, because that is what Black people have always done. In the face of slavery, we rose. In the face of segregation, we rose. In the face of colonialism, we rose. In the face of poverty, we rose. In the face of violence, we rose. In the face of every system designed to keep us down, we rose. Not because it was easy, not because the world helped us, not because justice was swift or certain, but because rising is in our nature, because the God who created us did not create us for silence. He created us for purpose, for glory, for legacy, and no human institution, however powerful, however cruel, however persistent, can ultimately defeat divine purpose. We endured, we built, we led, we created, we rose, and we are still rising. The gospel declares that every human being is made in the image of God. To forget the contributions of a people is not merely historical oversight. It is a failure to honor that image fully, but remembrance restores dignity, truth restores clarity, and every time truth is spoken, silence loses ground. We endured, we built, we created, we led, we rose, and we are still rising. May we have the courage to tell the story whole. This is a Black History Month declaration from Black Canadian Legacy TV, preserving the stories, honoring the legacy, building the future. Share this message because these stories deserve to be told. Subscribe for more stories that demand to be remembered. Documentary storytelling meets heritage education. Black history told with pride, power, and purpose. As we journey through the past to understand the power of the present, subscribe and join the movement to keep these legacies alive, because our history is Canada's history.